What if the next great global conflict is not a distant hypothetical event decades away from our present reality? What if, instead, it is already unfolding around us, not in a sudden cataclysmic explosion but piece by painstaking piece? Imagine a war that does not begin with grand declarations broadcast across the world's media or with formal ultimatums delivered between heads of state. Instead, it starts with subtle actions, with movements in the shadows of international politics. This war is fought through proxies, where larger powers arm and fund smaller nations, turning regional disputes into theaters for their own geopolitical ambitions. It is a slow, creeping advance that steadily normalizes conflict and desensitizes the global population to the true scale of the danger that is steadily building, day by day. This new form of global confrontation is also waged in the digital realm, a silent battleground where the stakes are just as high. Cyber warfare has become the vanguard of modern aggression, capable of crippling a nation's infrastructure without firing a single physical shot. Power grids can be shut down, financial systems thrown into chaos, and communication networks silenced, all through the invisible work of state-sponsored hackers. These are not isolated acts of sabotage, they are calculated moves in a much larger strategic game. Each successful breach, each stolen piece of intelligence, and each disruption of civil society contributes to a steady erosion of stability. The lines between peace and war become blurred, and the very definition of conflict is rewritten before our eyes. The terrifying climax to this thought experiment poses an even more profound question. What if this time, the culmination of these escalating tensions leads to a war from which no one can emerge victorious? What if the technological advancements in weaponry, particularly nuclear arsenals, have made the concept of a survivable world war an absolute impossibility? This is not merely a question of which side will win or lose, but a question of whether human civilization itself can endure the consequences of its own destructive capabilities. The very nature of modern warfare, combined with the interconnectedness of our global society, means that a conflict between major powers could trigger a domino effect with truly apocalyptic outcomes, leaving no corner of the earth untouched by its devastating reach. Welcome to what may be the final, most urgent question of our time. It is a question that hangs over our politics, our economies, and our very future. We are compelled to ask, will there be a World War III? And if it does come, if all the diplomatic off-ramps are missed and the world plunges into that abyss, will anyone be left to witness the aftermath? This is not a query for academics in ivory towers or for strategists in military bunkers alone. It is a question that every individual must confront, as the answer will determine the fate of everything we know and hold dear. The path forward is not yet written, but the warning signs are clearer than ever before. Tensions are not just rising, they are simmering to a boil on a global scale. All around the world, the pillars of the post-World War II international order are showing signs of severe strain. In Eastern Europe, Russia is engaged in a brutal and protracted war of attrition with Ukraine. A conflict that has already redrawn the security map of the continent and created the most significant land war in Europe since 1945. This is not a contained regional issue. It has become a focal point for a broader confrontation between Russia and the West, with NATO countries supplying immense military and financial aid to Kyiv. The conflict serves as a stark reminder of how quickly long-standing borders and international norms can be violently disregarded by a determined aggressor. Simultaneously, in the Indo-Pacific, the People's Republic of China is flexing its military and economic muscle with increasing confidence and aggression. Beijing has made its intentions toward Taiwan explicitly clear, stating that reunification is inevitable and refusing to rule out the use of force. This stance creates a dangerous flashpoint, as the United States has historically maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity while providing Taiwan with the means to defend itself. Beyond Taiwan, China's assertive actions in the South China Sea, where it has built and militarized artificial islands in disputed waters, challenge international maritime law and threaten the freedom of navigation for all nations, creating friction with its neighbors and with Western naval powers. Meanwhile, the Middle East remains a tinderbox of ancient rivalries and modern proxy wars, inching ever closer to a major regional conflagration. The long-standing shadow war between Iran and Israel has recently escalated, with direct military strikes breaking decades of unwritten rules. Each drone attack, missile launch, or covert operation brings these two powerful adversaries closer to an all-out direct conflict, a scenario that would inevitably draw in other nations. The United States, a key ally of Israel, would almost certainly be involved, and other regional powers like Saudi Arabia would be forced to take sides. The potential for this conflict to spiral out of control and disrupt global energy supplies is immense and growing daily. These are not isolated incidents happening in vacuums, independent of one another. We are not merely watching a series of unrelated crises unfold on our screens. Instead, we are witnessing the tightening of an intricate and dangerous web. A clear pattern is forming, connecting these disparate hotspots into a single, cohesive narrative of escalating global instability. From the missile tests of a nuclear-armed North Korea to the persistent military presence of the United States on every continent, each event is a link in a chain. We are watching a series of sparks being generated around the world, each one with the potential to be the single ignition point that sets the entire planet ablaze. The question is no longer if a spark will fly, but which one will land on the fuel first. In the heart of Eastern Europe, a conflict rages that has shattered the continent's long-held illusion of perpetual peace. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is more than just a territorial dispute. It is a grinding, brutal war of attrition that has become the bloodiest in Europe for generations. The flat, scarred landscapes of the Donbas have transformed into a hellscape of trench warfare, artillery duels and drone attacks, evoking the grim specters of the First World War, yet fought with the terrifying precision of 21st century technology. This is not a distant problem for a faraway land. It represents a direct and audacious challenge to the entire post-Cold War security architecture, a system built on the principles of national sovereignty and the inadmissibility of acquiring territory by force. The Kremlin's actions have sent a shockwave across the globe, forcing nations to re-evaluate their alliances and drastically increase their defense spending in a new era of great power competition. The war in Ukraine has evolved into a vast proxy conflict, a dangerous test of wills between Russia and the collective power of the West. While Ukrainian soldiers fight and die on the front lines, their ability to resist is fueled by a continuous river of advanced weaponry, intelligence, and financial support from NATO countries, led by the United States. This support has been crucial, but it also walks a razor's edge. Every new delivery of long-range missiles, every deployment of more sophisticated tanks, and every piece of shared satellite intelligence raises the stakes. Moscow has repeatedly warned that it views this support as direct involvement in the conflict, blurring the lines between assistance and co-belligerence. The risk of a miscalculation, a stray missile landing in a NATO country, or a deliberate escalation by a desperate Russia, hangs like the sword of Damocles over the entire continent, threatening to trigger a direct clash between nuclear-armed powers. The economic fallout from this single conflict has already demonstrated the fragility of our interconnected world. Global energy markets were thrown into turmoil as Europe scrambled to wean itself off Russian gas, leading to price shocks and fears of a cold winter. Food supply chains were severed as Ukrainian grain, a staple for millions in the developing world, was blockaded in Black Sea ports. This weaponization of food and energy is a key feature of modern hybrid warfare, proving that a conflict's impact is never confined to the battlefield. The sanctions imposed on Russia, while intended to cripple its war machine, have also contributed to the formation of a parallel economic system, strengthening ties between Moscow and other nations resentful of the Western-led order. The war is not just redrawing military maps, it is reconfiguring the very flow of global trade and finance. Beyond the immediate human and economic costs, the war in Ukraine serves as a powerful and grim symbol. It is a manifestation of a resurgent aggressive nationalism that believed its time had passed. It signals the return of large-scale conventional warfare between states, an idea many strategists had dismissed in favor of counterterrorism and asymmetric conflicts. Russia's actions and the global response to them have created a clear dividing line, a new iron curtain descending not just across Europe but across the world's ideologies. This single hotspot is a microcosm of the larger gathering storm, a place where the ambitions of one nation have ignited a fire that threatens to spread far beyond its borders, pulling more and more actors into its destructive vortex and setting a dangerous precedent for the future. Shifting our gaze to the east, the serene waters of the Indo-Pacific belie a tension that is arguably even more perilous for global stability. Here, the primary flashpoint is Taiwan, a vibrant, self-governing democracy that China's Communist Party regards as a renegade province. Beijing's rhetoric has grown increasingly bellicose, with President Xi Jinping declaring that the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland is a historic mission that must be fulfilled, and explicitly stating that the option of force will never be renounced. This is not empty posturing. China's military, the People's Liberation Army, has been undergoing a breathtaking modernization, developing capabilities specifically designed to execute an invasion of the island and to deter any foreign power, namely the United States, from intervening. The constant military drills, air defense zone incursions, and naval patrols are a form of psychological warfare, designed to exhaust Taiwan's defenses and normalize the idea of an impending conflict. At the heart of this standoff is the strategic ambiguity of the United States. For decades, Washington has maintained a delicate balance, acknowledging Beijing's One China policy while simultaneously selling arms to Taiwan under the Taiwan Relations Act. This policy was designed to prevent both a unilateral declaration of independence by Taipei and an unprovoked invasion by Beijing. However, this ambiguity is now under immense pressure. As China's military power grows, the question of whether the United States would or could successfully defend Taiwan becomes more urgent. A Chinese invasion of Taiwan would not be a regional affair. It would be a cataclysm. It would pit the world's two largest economies and most powerful militaries against each other in a direct, high-intensity conflict, with the potential for catastrophic escalation that could easily spiral into a Third World War. The conflict over Taiwan is merely the most acute symptom of a much broader strategic competition unfolding across the vast expanse of the Pacific. China's assertive behavior in the South China Sea is another critical front in this gathering storm. By building and militarizing artificial islands on disputed reefs and atolls, Beijing has laid claim to nearly the entire waterway through which a third of global maritime trade passes. This move directly challenges international law, as established by the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and antagonizes neighboring countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia. The United States and its allies regularly conduct freedom of navigation operations to contest these claims, leading to tense, close encounters between warships and military aircraft. Each of these encounters carries the risk of an accident or misjudgment that could spark a shooting war. This Pacific powder keg is forcing nations in the region and beyond to choose sides. Alliances are being strengthened, and new security pacts are being forged. The Quad, an informal strategic dialogue between the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, has been revitalized as a counterweight to Chinese influence. The AUKUS Security Pact will see the US and UK provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarine technology, a clear signal of long-term commitment to regional security. In response, China has deepened its strategic partnership with Russia, creating a powerful authoritarian axis. The Indo-Pacific is rapidly becoming a chessboard for great powers, where the island of Taiwan is the most critical piece, but the game itself involves the future of the entire global order. A single misstep here could detonate the entire region. The Middle East has long been a cauldron of simmering conflicts, but the heat has been turned up to a dangerous new level. The historic enmity between Iran and Israel has broken out of the shadows and into the open. For years, their struggle was waged through proxies, cyber attacks, and targeted assassinations. Now that unspoken agreement has been shattered by direct state-on-state military strikes. This escalation represents a fundamental shift, moving the region perilously closer to full-scale war. A direct conflict between these heavily armed powers would not remain a bilateral affair. It would ignite a wider conflagration, dragging in Iran's network of proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen, and inevitably pulling in the United States. The implications would ripple across the globe instantly. The Strait of Hormuz, through which a fifth of the world's oil passes, could be closed by Iran, triggering a global energy crisis. This economic shockwave would cripple economies worldwide, leading to hyperinflation and social unrest far from the Middle East battlefields. Furthermore, Israel is a nuclear-armed state, while Iran's nuclear program is more advanced than ever. The specter of nuclear exchange is no longer fringe theory but terrifyingly plausible. A conventional war could quickly escalate if one side faced existential threat, creating a nightmare scenario making regions uninhabitable for generations. Meanwhile, in Northeast Asia, North Korea's isolated regime continues as an agent of instability. Under Kim Jong-un, the country has accelerated its nuclear and missile programs at an alarming rate. These weapons are designed to strike South Korea and Japan, and even the United States mainland. Every missile launch is calculated provocation, testing international resolve while advancing military capabilities. The regime's belligerent rhetoric ensures permanent hair-trigger alert. North Korea's danger is magnified by its relationship with China and Russia. While Beijing is Pyongyang's ally, it struggles to control its volatile neighbor. An attack on South Korea or Japan would trigger massive US response. Such conflict on China's doorstep would present Beijing an impossible choice: abandon its ally or risk direct confrontation with America. Both the Middle East and Korean Peninsula are flashpoints linked to larger geopolitical struggle. Each is a storm system capable of creating a perfect storm of global war. To understand the precariousness of our present moment, we must first look back, over a century ago, to the world before the Great War. In the early 1900s, Europe was experiencing an unprecedented period of globalization, technological advancement, and economic interdependence, not unlike our own era. The continent was connected by telegraph cables, railways, and intricate trade relationships. Many leaders and thinkers of the time believed that this deep interconnection made a major war between the great powers of Europe not only unthinkable but economically impossible. They argued that the prosperity of nations was so deeply intertwined that a large-scale conflict would be mutually ruinous, a form of collective economic suicide. This belief in a rational, self-interested peace proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation, a fatal underestimation of the irrational forces of nationalism, ambition, and fear that were simmering just beneath the surface of civilized society. The trigger for World War I was, on its face, a regional event: the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo. It was a single spark, but it landed in a landscape that had been meticulously prepared for a wildfire. Over the preceding decades, Europe had been quietly divided into a complex and rigid web of military alliances. The Triple Entente, linking France, Russia, and Great Britain, stood opposite the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These pacts were intended to create a balance of power, to act as a deterrent. Instead, they created an automated doomsday machine, a chain reaction mechanism that, once activated, would pull nation after nation into the abyss with an unstoppable and tragic momentum. What followed the assassination was not a measured diplomatic response but a rapid, almost mechanical cascade of ultimatums and mobilizations. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, issued an impossible set of demands to Serbia. When Serbia could not fully comply, Austria-Hungary declared war. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of the Slavic peoples, began to mobilize its vast army to defend Serbia. This triggered Germany's own mobilization plans, which required a preemptive strike against Russia's ally France by invading through neutral Belgium. The violation of Belgian neutrality, in turn, compelled Great Britain to honor its treaty obligations and declare war on Germany. Within weeks, a localized Balkan crisis had metastasized into a full-blown continental war, dragging millions into a slaughter that no one had truly wanted or anticipated. Today, we see unnerving echoes of this tragic history. We live in another age of deep global interconnection, yet we also see the hardening of new alliances and strategic blocs. NATO's Mutual Defense Clause, Article 5, functions as a modern version of the pre-1914 pacts, a powerful deterrent that also carries the risk of automatic, widespread escalation. The growing strategic partnership between Russia and China, along with their alignment with nations like Iran and North Korea, forms a counterweight to this Western alliance. The danger, as in 1914, is that a regional conflict involving one member of these blocs could trigger a similar horrifying cascade, pulling the world's major powers into a direct confrontation not through deliberate choice, but through the inflexible logic of treaty obligations and the perceived need to support one's allies. If World War I teaches us about the dangers of unintended escalation, the prelude to World War II offers a different yet equally vital lesson: the peril of ignoring deliberate aggression in the vain hope of preserving peace. The 1930s were a decade defined by a collective failure of will, a period when the world's democracies watched the methodical rise of expansionist authoritarian regimes and chose appeasement over confrontation. Adolf Hitler's ambitions were not a secret. He had laid them out with chilling clarity in his manifesto, Mein Kampf. Yet, as he began to dismantle the post-World War I order piece by piece, the international community responded with hesitation, condemnation without consequence, and a desperate desire to avoid another catastrophic conflict at any cost. This desire for peace, while understandable, ultimately made a far more destructive war inevitable. The path to war was a series of incremental steps, each one testing the resolve of the Allied powers and finding it wanting. In 1936, German troops reoccupied the Rhineland, a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles, but faced no military response. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, again without significant opposition. Later that year, at the Munich Conference, Britain and France infamously agreed to the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, sacrificing a sovereign democracy on the altar of appeasement. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home proclaiming he had secured peace for our time. This illusion of peace was shattered less than a year later when Hitler, emboldened by the lack of resistance, invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia and then, finally, Poland, forcing the Allies' hand and plunging the world into its second global war. The lesson from this period is a painful one. Diplomacy without a credible threat of force is often perceived as weakness by aggressors. The failure to draw and enforce red lines early on did not prevent war. It simply delayed it while allowing the adversary to grow stronger, more confident, and better positioned to achieve its aims. Today, we face similar challenges as we watch authoritarian powers test the boundaries of the international system. Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea was met with sanctions but no military intervention, arguably setting the stage for the full-scale invasion in 2022. China's gradual militarization of the South China Sea has proceeded for years, despite international protests and legal rulings, steadily changing the strategic reality on the ground. The question we must ask is whether our current responses are deterring future aggression or simply repeating the mistakes of the 1930s. The parallels are deeply unsettling. We again hear calls to avoid escalation at all costs, to offer off-ramps to leaders who have demonstrated a clear disregard for international law and sovereignty. While the pursuit of peace is noble, history warns us that a peace purchased at the expense of a smaller nation's freedom is often temporary and illusory. The failure to act decisively in the face of unambiguous aggression can create a strategic momentum that becomes impossible to reverse. The world of 1939 teaches us that some threats cannot be placated or negotiated away. They must be confronted with strength and resolve, because the cost of inaction, in the long run, can be infinitely greater than the cost of taking a stand. After the devastation of two world wars, humanity entered a new and perhaps even more terrifying era of confrontation, the Cold War. For nearly half a century, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the precipice of a conflict that would have been unlike any before it. This was not a war that would be fought with tanks crossing borders or navies clashing on the high seas in the traditional sense. Instead, it was a global struggle of ideologies, waged through proxy wars, espionage, and a relentless technological arms race. At its core was the terrifying doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The development of vast nuclear arsenals by both superpowers created a paradoxical stability, a so-called balance of terror where the cost of a direct war was so unimaginably high, total annihilation, that it could never be fought. This period offers a crucial lesson in brinkmanship and crisis management. There were numerous moments when the world held its breath, when a single miscalculation could have triggered a nuclear exchange. The Berlin blockade, the Korean War, and most famously the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, brought the superpowers to the very edge of the abyss. During those 13 days in October, the fate of the world rested on the decisions of a few individuals in Washington and Moscow. What ultimately prevented catastrophe was not a lack of will to fight, but a profound and sobering awareness of the consequences. Both President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev understood that once the nuclear threshold was crossed, there would be no winners, no retreat, and no future. The Cold War taught us that even in the most intense rivalries, channels of communication are essential. Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Moscow-Washington hotline was established, a direct link designed to prevent a nuclear war from starting through accident or miscommunication. A series of arms control treaties, such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, were painstakingly negotiated. These agreements, while imperfect, created a framework of transparency and predictability. They were a tacit acknowledgement by both sides that while they remained adversaries, they shared a common interest in survival. This architecture of risk reduction was a vital if uncelebrated achievement that helped keep the peace for decades. Today, much of that hard-won architecture is gone. Arms control treaties have been abandoned, and the lines of communication between today's great powers are frayed or, honestly, non-existent. We are entering a new, multipolar nuclear age with more nuclear-armed states and more complex rivalries than during the Cold War. The clear bipolar logic of MAD is being replaced by a far more chaotic and unpredictable environment. The lessons of the Cold War are therefore more urgent than ever. They remind us that while humans are capable of creating weapons of total destruction, we are also capable of the restraint and pragmatic statecraft required to step back from the brink. The shadow of the Cold War looms as both a warning of how close we can come to annihilation and a hopeful reminder that awareness and careful management can indeed pull us through. Taiwan is the world's most dangerous flashpoint. A clash of systems and ideologies, not just territory. For China's leaders, reunification is a core objective, driving massive military buildup aimed at the island. The US walks a tightrope, bound by law to help Taiwan defend itself, yet wary of direct war with nuclear-armed China. Any invasion would trigger a global crisis: missiles, amphibious assaults, and attacks on US bases in the Pacific. The economic shock would be instant as global supply chains and semiconductor production collapse. Taiwan's fate could decide whether the 21st century is defined by uneasy peace or catastrophic war. The war in Ukraine is a fuse burning toward NATO's tripwire Article 5, collective defense. A single misstep, an errant missile, a desperate move could turn a proxy war into a direct clash between Russia and 32 NATO nations. Such a conflict would unleash large-scale battles across Europe and risk nuclear escalation as Russia's doctrine allows first use if losing. The West arms Ukraine to avoid this, but the balance is precarious. The stakes not just Ukraine's future, but the security of Europe and the world's nuclear stability. War here would make global conflict a terrifying immediate reality. Two more flashpoints threaten global stability: the Iran-Israel rivalry and North Korea's nuclear ambitions. A direct Iran-Israel war would ignite the region, draw in the US, and risk closing the Strait of Hormuz, triggering a global energy crisis. Both sides possess or approach nuclear capability, raising the specter of nuclear war in the Middle East. Meanwhile, North Korea's unpredictable regime threatens South Korea, Japan, and the US with nuclear missiles. Any conflict on the Korean peninsula could draw in China and the US, escalating rapidly. These crises are not isolated. They're linked to the broader great power competition, each a potential spark for global war. As the world fractures, a new axis emerges. China and Russia at its core, united by opposition to the Western order. Their partnership is strategic and ideological, joined by Iran and North Korea, who provide military and economic support. This bloc challenges Western dominance, offering an alternative model of sovereignty and development, appealing to many in the global South. They coordinate militarily, economically, and diplomatically, using institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. It's not a formal alliance, but a fluid coalition determined to undermine the US-led system. Their growing strength and shared grievances make them a formidable force on the world stage. Opposing this axis is the Western Alliance, NATO, the US, and partners in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. The war in Ukraine has reinvigorated NATO, but internal divisions and political volatility threaten its unity. Allies like Japan, South Korea, and Australia are strengthening ties with the US to counter China and North Korea. Yet debates over burden sharing and shifting political winds create uncertainty about long-term commitments. The Western Bloc stands for the current international order, but must adapt to face a determined revisionist coalition. Its greatest challenge? Maintaining unity and resolve in a new era of global confrontation. Between these two hardening blocs lies a vast and critically important group of nations, the undecided. These countries, often referred to as the Global South, are not ideologically committed to either side. They are pragmatic, pursuing their own national interests and refusing to be drawn into what they see as a new great power competition that is not of their making. Towering among these swing states is India. As the world's most populous nation and a rapidly growing economy, India walks a tightrope of strategic autonomy. It is a member of the Quad with the United States and its allies, sharing concerns about Chinese aggression, yet it also maintains deep historical ties with Russia, its primary military supplier, and is a key member of the BRICS Forum. India's decision on which way to lean in a global conflict could decisively tip the balance of power. Other major regional powers are also carving out their own independent paths, seeking to maximize their leverage by engaging with both sides. Turkey, a NATO member, has played a complex role, acting as a mediator in the Ukraine conflict while also purchasing Russian missile systems and deepening economic ties with the Axis powers. In the Middle East, traditional United States partners like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are hedging their bets. While still reliant on American security guarantees, they are actively strengthening their relationships with China, their biggest oil customer, and have even engaged in diplomacy with their rival, Iran. These nations are no longer willing to be simple client states, they are becoming independent poles in a genuinely multipolar world. Across Africa and South America, this sentiment of non-alignment is even more pronounced. Many nations in these regions harbor a historical resentment of Western colonialism and are wary of being lectured on democracy and human rights. They see China and Russia as offering a partnership based on economics and infrastructure, without the political conditions often attached to Western aid. For them, the conflict between Russia and the West is a European war, and the rivalry between the United States and China is a struggle for dominance from which they wish to remain aloof. They will trade with both, accept investment from both, and vote on a case-by-case basis at the United Nations, their decisions driven by pragmatism, not ideology. This vast, unaligned middle ground represents the new global battlefield. The competition between the two major blocs is increasingly a struggle for the hearts and minds and resources of these swing states. Their decisions will determine the flow of critical minerals, the control of strategic waterways, and the balance of votes in international institutions. In the event of a global conflict, their neutrality would be put under immense pressure. The side that could either win their support or, at the very least, ensure their benevolent neutrality would gain a significant strategic advantage. The world is no longer a simple bipolar chessboard. It is a complex three-dimensional game where these undecided nations are not merely pawns, but powerful players in their own right. If a full-scale war breaks out between the world's great powers, the most terrifying question is not if nuclear weapons will be used, but when and how. The blunt, horrifying answer is yes, it is almost a certainty. The comforting logic of the Cold War, where mutually assured destruction acted as a powerful brake on escalation, is fraying in our new multipolar world. The lines are blurrier, the actors more numerous, and the doctrines more aggressive. For a nation like Russia facing the overwhelming conventional might of NATO, or for China, locked in a desperate battle over Taiwan, the temptation to use a tactical nuclear weapon to stave off defeat could become irresistible. This would not be seen as an act of suicide, but as a rational, if horrifying, move on the geopolitical chessboard. A calculated gamble to force a de-escalation by demonstrating an unmatched resolve to win at any cost. Today, 9 nations possess the power to end the world as we know it. The United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, France, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea collectively hold an arsenal of over 13,000 nuclear warheads. Each one of these is exponentially more powerful than the bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is not simply a collection of weapons, it is a distributed doomsday device, a planetary self-destruct system with multiple triggers held by nations with competing interests and deep-seated animosities. The idea that a global conflict involving several of these states could be fought to its conclusion without a single one reaching for its ultimate weapon seems dangerously naive. The pressures of war, the fog of misinformation, and the sheer panic of impending national defeat create a psychological crucible where the unthinkable becomes thinkable, and the thinkable becomes inevitable. The escalation would likely not begin with an all-out apocalyptic exchange. It would start smaller, with the use of so-called tactical or low-yield nuclear weapons. A warhead used to destroy a carrier strike group at sea, to obliterate a hardened military command bunker, or to annihilate an advancing armored column. The nation that fires first would justify it as a limited military action, a move to shock the enemy into submission and bring them to the negotiating table. But this logic is a fatal fallacy. It fundamentally misunderstands the symbolic power of crossing the nuclear threshold. Once that line is crossed, for the first time in nearly a century, the rules of warfare are instantly rewritten. The response would be swift, driven by the need to retaliate in kind to avoid showing weakness, setting off a tit-for-tat exchange. This terrifying dance of escalation is a core part of modern nuclear strategy. Each retaliation would be designed to be slightly more devastating than the last, a deadly game of chicken played with cities and lives. A tactical strike on a military target is answered with a strike on a major logistics hub. That is answered with a strike on a dual-use port city. The firebreak between tactical and strategic use would vanish in the smoke and chaos. What begins as a calculated military move rapidly spirals into a full-scale nuclear exchange, targeting population centers and industrial heartlands. The logic of war, once unleashed, has its own momentum. From the first limited use, the path to global thermonuclear war is a short and slippery slope, one from which there is likely no return. The consequences of even a limited nuclear exchange would be catastrophic on a scale that defies human imagination. It would take far less than the world's full arsenal to plunge civilization into a new dark age. Scientific models have shown that a regional nuclear war, for instance between India and Pakistan, using just 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs, less than 1% of the global total, would be enough to trigger a global climate collapse. The immense firestorms from incinerated cities would inject millions of tons of soot and smoke into the upper atmosphere. This thick black cloud would spread around the globe within weeks, creating a veil that would block a significant portion of sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface, a phenomenon known as nuclear winter. The environmental collapse would be swift and brutal. Global average temperatures would plummet, rivaling those of the last ice age. This sudden, drastic cooling would shatter agricultural systems worldwide. Growing seasons in the major breadbaskets of the northern hemisphere would be eliminated for years. Crops would fail on a global scale. The monsoon rains that billions depend upon would falter. The world would face a famine unlike any in human history, leading to the starvation of not millions but potentially billions of people. Even nations untouched by a single bomb, far from the conflict zone, would see their societies crumble, as food supplies vanish and social order disintegrates into a desperate struggle for survival. There is no hiding from a nuclear war. Its fallout is planetary. Beyond the climatic devastation, the radioactive fallout would poison the Earth for generations. Regions directly targeted would become uninhabitable exclusion zones, their land and water contaminated with invisible poisons that cause cancer, birth defects, and a host of horrific illnesses. But the radiation would not stay put. It would be carried by wind and water currents, contaminating ecosystems thousands of miles away. The very building blocks of life would be corrupted. Clean water would become a priceless commodity. The intricate web of global biodiversity would be shredded, leading to mass extinctions and the collapse of oceanic food chains. Humanity's survivors would be left to wander a toxic and broken planet, living shorter, sicker lives in the shadow of their own creation. In such a world, there are no victors. There are no spoils of war. The very concept of winning becomes a grotesque mockery. The nation that wins the nuclear exchange inherits a poisoned, frozen, and starving world. The intricate global civilization we have built over millennia, our art, our science, our economies, our laws, would be reduced to rubble and bitter memory. The survivors, if any, would be cursed to live in a primitive state, haunted by the ghosts of a world they lost. This is the ultimate stake of a Third World War. It is not about which alliance prevails or which ideology triumphs. It is about whether humanity itself has a future. The nuclear shadow reminds us that in the next global war, the final enemy is not another country, but extinction itself. In the opening hours of a Third World War, the first salvos will not be fired by missiles, but by malware. The initial assault will be silent, invisible, and utterly paralyzing, targeting the fragile digital backbone upon which our entire modern civilization is built. Long before the first soldier crosses a border or the first bomb falls, state-sponsored cyber warriors will launch a coordinated digital Pearl Harbor. Their goal will be to induce systemic chaos, to turn the very tools of our interconnectedness against us. Power grids will flicker and die, plunging entire continents into darkness. Financial markets will be thrown into turmoil as banking systems are frozen, credit cards cease to function, and trillions of dollars in digital wealth vanish in an instant. This is not warfare on a distant front, it is an attack on the operating system of society itself, designed to cripple a nation from within, before the physical battle has even begun. The chaos will spread with the speed of light. Communication networks, the central nervous system of our world, will be among the first casualties. Satellites will be jammed, blinded, or sent tumbling from orbit, severing the links that enable GPS navigation, global broadcasting, and military command and control. Undersea fiber optic cables, the conduits for over 95% of international data, will be physically cut by covert submarines, isolating nations and continents. On the ground, mobile networks and internet services will become unreliable or completely inoperable, either through direct attack or overwhelming traffic. The instantaneous flow of information we take for granted will be replaced by an unnerving silence, punctuated only by waves of weaponized disinformation designed to sow panic, mistrust, and division among a terrified and confused populace. With the digital infrastructure shattered, the real-world consequences will cascade rapidly. Without power, water treatment plants will fail, and clean water will stop flowing to homes. Without GPS, logistics networks will grind to a halt, meaning trucks cannot deliver fuel, food, or medicine. Hospitals, already overwhelmed, will see their life support systems and digital records fail. Economies, which are now little more than vast, complex webs of digital transactions, will effectively cease to exist. The concept of money will become meaningless when ATMs are dark and bank accounts are inaccessible. Society's thin veneer of order will begin to crack and then shatter as the fundamental systems that support daily life are methodically and deliberately dismantled, all before a single shot is fired in anger. This initial phase of collapse is a form of strategic strangulation. It is designed to soften up the target, to create maximum internal disruption, and to demonstrate the futility of resistance. The enemy in this phase is not a visible army, but an unseen force that has turned your own technology against you. The trust that underpins society, trust in the government, in financial institutions, in the media, in the basic functioning of everyday life, will be the primary casualty. People will be left isolated, frightened, and cut off from reliable information, creating the perfect psychological conditions for the conventional phase of warfare that is about to be unleashed upon a world that has already been brought to its knees, unplugged and unprepared for the physical horror to come. In the weeks following the initial outbreak of war, a new and more primal terror will emerge: the collapse of the global food supply chain. The modern world is fed by a logistical miracle, a just-in-time system of staggering complexity that moves food across oceans and continents to stock the shelves of our local supermarkets. This system, however, is incredibly brittle. With major shipping lanes transformed into war zones, the 90% of global trade that travels by sea will evaporate almost overnight. The container ships carrying grain from the Americas, fruit from Africa, and spices from Asia will stop sailing. Insurance for these voyages will become unobtainable. The seamless, invisible network that keeps billions fed will be severed at its source, triggering a countdown to starvation on a planetary scale. Even within nations not directly involved in the fighting, the internal chains of supply will break down. The scarcity of fuel, a direct result of disrupted global oil markets and crippled refineries, will immobilize the trucks, trains, and planes that transport food from farms to cities. The lack of electricity will shut down cold storage facilities, leading to the spoilage of vast quantities of perishable goods. The very machinery of industrial agriculture, tractors, harvesters, and irrigation systems, will sputter to a halt without diesel and spare parts. Within a matter of weeks, supermarket shelves, once a symbol of boundless abundance, will be stripped bare. The initial panic buying will give way to a grim and permanent emptiness, a stark visual representation of society's descent into a new age of scarcity. As the formal economy disintegrates, society will fracture along lines of desperation. Cities, once centers of opportunity, will become concrete traps, their inhabitants cut off from the sources of food production. Food riots will become commonplace as starving crowds clash with overwhelmed security forces for control of dwindling government stockpiles. Black markets will flourish, where a loaf of bread or a can of beans might be traded for family heirlooms or life savings. The social contract will dissolve, replaced by the brutal logic of survival. Neighbors will turn on neighbors. Communities will barricade themselves against outsiders. The war will no longer be something fought by armies in faraway lands. It will be a daily, personal battle for the next meal, fought in the streets of every town and city. For the developing world, the consequences will be even more immediate and cataclysmic. Nations that depend on food imports to feed their populations will face wholesale famine within months. The humanitarian aid systems that might have once provided a safety net will be non-existent, their resources diverted, or their logistics impossible. The result will be a humanitarian disaster of unprecedented scale, a Malthusian nightmare made real by modern conflict. This great hunger will be the second wave of the war's assault, a silent and indiscriminate killer that respects no borders. It will prove that in a truly globalized world, no one is safe. The chaos of the battlefield will be matched by the quiet, desperate chaos of a world that has simply forgotten how to feed itself. If such a war were to last for months, the world would descend into a state of global famine, a catastrophic hunger driven by the collapse of agriculture and the severing of supply chains. The initial shock of empty shelves and food riots would give way to a prolonged, agonizing period of mass starvation, a grim reality for billions. But if the conflict were to drag on for years, with nuclear exchanges poisoning the land and sky, we would face something far more final. We would be confronting the genuine possibility of an extinction-level event, a catastrophe engineered not by an asteroid or a supervolcano, but by our own hands. The very survival of Homo sapiens would be called into question, our species' long and storied journey brought to an abrupt and violent end in a self-inflicted apocalypse. This is the ultimate, terrifying stake of a third world war. The mechanism for this extinction is chillingly plausible. A major nuclear exchange would trigger a full-blown nuclear winter, plunging the planet into a deep, artificial cold. The thick veil of soot in the atmosphere would block the sun's light for years, causing temperatures to plummet dramatically across the globe. This sudden, unnatural climate shift would mean the end of agriculture as we know it. The great breadbaskets of the world would become frozen wastelands, unable to support the crops that form the foundation of our food supply. The delicate ecosystems that have sustained life for millennia would unravel with terrifying speed, leaving a barren and hostile planet in their wake, a world actively hostile to the continued existence of complex life. Beyond the freezing darkness, the world would be saturated with deadly radiation. Vast regions, particularly across the northern hemisphere where most of the conflict would likely occur, would become uninhabitable for centuries. The invisible poison of radioactive fallout would contaminate the soil, the water, and every living thing. Even those countries that were not directly bombed, those who believed themselves safe from the conflict, would suffer the consequences of this ecological collapse. Their climates would change, their food imports would cease, and the radioactive poisons would eventually drift into their lands and oceans on the winds and currents. In this scenario, there is no neutrality. The entire planet becomes a casualty, a single interconnected system condemned by the actions of a few. In the worst-case scenario, one that strategists and scientists have modeled with grim precision, there are no winners. There are no victors to survey their conquered territory or to write the history of the conflict. The very concept of victory becomes a meaningless abstraction in a world where survival itself is the only prize, and one that may be unattainable. There would only be survivors, scattered pockets of humanity huddled in bunkers or remote corners of the world, living in a broken, toxic environment. And perhaps in the end, not even that. The final verdict of a third world war may not be a new world order, but a silent, empty world, a monument to a species that achieved consciousness only to use it to orchestrate its own demise. But what if we stop it? After surveying this landscape of almost certain doom, we must confront the most critical variable in this entire equation, the human factor. History, in all its darkness, shows us something both terrifying and profoundly hopeful. It reveals that while human beings are undeniably capable of orchestrating total war, of committing acts of unimaginable cruelty and destruction, we are also capable of something else. We possess a unique ability to learn, to adapt, and when faced with the abyss, to collectively step back from the edge. This capacity for reason, for empathy, and for self-preservation is the last best hope for our civilization, the one force that can defy the seemingly inexorable logic of escalation and collapse. The Cold War stands as the most powerful testament to this capacity. For over 4 decades, the United States and the Soviet Union held the power to annihilate each other, and the world along with them, many times over. They fought brutal proxy wars, engaged in relentless espionage, and came terrifyingly close to nuclear war on several occasions. Yet the final cataclysmic button was never pushed. Annihilation was avoided not because the leaders were inherently peaceful men, or because the desire for dominance had vanished. It was avoided because enough people on both sides, from presidents and premiers in their bunkers to scientists and strategists and ordinary citizens, understood precisely what was at stake. The shared fear of extinction became a more powerful force than the ideological hatred that divided them. The survival of humanity during that perilous era was not an accident. It was the result of conscious choice, of painstaking diplomacy, and of building guardrails against our own worst instincts. It was the product of arms control treaties, of back-channel communications, and of a shared, terrifying awareness of the consequences of failure. That awareness is what is desperately needed today. The difference between a future defined by extinction and one defined by survival is not fate or destiny, it is knowledge. It is the widespread, visceral understanding that the path we are on, the path of rising nationalism, of abandoned treaties, and of normalized conflict, leads directly to a precipice from which there is no return. This awareness must transcend borders and politics. World War III is not a pre-written prophecy, it is not an inevitable outcome, it is a possibility, a dark potential that grows more likely with every act of aggression, every broken treaty, and every failure of diplomacy. But as long as it remains a possibility and not a certainty, we retain the power of choice. The decisions being made right now, today, in the corridors of power, in corporate boardrooms, and in the minds of citizens around the world, are the ones that will shape the future of our species. The human factor is the wild card. We are the authors of our own fate, and the final chapter has not yet been written. We possess the capacity for total war, but we also possess the capacity for survival. The choice is ours. We stand at a profound and perilous crossroads in human history, a moment defined by escalating conflict and converging crises. The specter of a third world war, once a distant fear confined to history books and speculative fiction, now looms as a tangible and terrifying possibility. We have explored the flashpoints, from the fields of Ukraine to the waters surrounding Taiwan. We have traced the hardening lines of new alliances, a global chessboard being set for a final cataclysmic game. We have confronted the horrifying certainty of nuclear escalation and the subsequent collapse of the systems that sustain our civilization. The path towards this global conflagration is not hidden, it is a well-lit road, and we are walking steadily down it step by deliberate step. The warning signs are no longer subtle whispers, they are screaming sirens that grow louder with each passing day. However, the most critical lesson to take from this examination is that this dark future is not inevitable. World War III is not a destiny that has been preordained or a fate from which we cannot escape. It remains for now a possibility. A deeply alarming and increasingly probable one, but a possibility nonetheless. The distinction is crucial, because within that space between possibility and certainty lies the full measure of human agency. History is not a force that happens to us. It is a story that we write with our choices, both individually and collectively. The future is not a fixed point on the horizon, but a fluid landscape shaped by the decisions being made right now, at this very moment, in the halls of power, in military command centers, and in the hearts and minds of people across the globe. The architecture of our world is fragile, built on treaties, trust, and a shared understanding that global cooperation is preferable to global conflict. But that architecture is crumbling. It is being actively dismantled by nations that see more to gain from chaos than from order, and it is being neglected by those who have grown complacent, forgetting the bloody lessons of the 20th century. The responsibility to shore up these foundations, to rebuild the guardrails against war, falls upon this generation. It requires a renewed commitment to diplomacy, a rejection of hyper-nationalism, and a clear-eyed recognition that in our deeply interconnected world, the security of one nation is ultimately inseparable from the security of all. The alternative is to allow the logic of conflict to run its course. Therefore, the question is not simply whether war will come, but whether we will choose to stop it. The power to pull back from the brink still resides within our grasp. It requires courage from our leaders to seek dialogue over confrontation, and wisdom from our citizens to demand peace over the siren song of war. The chain of events that could lead to global catastrophe can be broken. Each flashpoint can be de-escalated, each alliance can be used for stability rather than aggression, and each misunderstanding can be clarified through communication, but the window for such choices is closing. The momentum of conflict is building, and the forces of division are gathering strength. We are not yet at the point of no return, but we are dangerously close to it. As our journey through the shadows of potential war comes to an end, we are left with a series of urgent and deeply personal questions. The grand geopolitical narrative ultimately distills down to a stark and intimate reality. So you must ask yourself, with a clear and honest mind, a question that cuts through the noise of daily life. If war were to break out tomorrow, if the digital world went dark and the supply chains collapsed, is your country prepared? Does it possess the resilience, the resources and the social cohesion to withstand the initial shock? Can it protect its people not only from bombs and missiles, but from the chaos, hunger and disease that will inevitably follow in their wake? The answer, for almost every nation on Earth, is a deeply unsettling no. This leads to an even more fundamental inquiry, one that transcends national borders and looks at our species as a whole. The final and most important question is not about the survival of any single country or alliance. It is about whether humanity can survive itself. Have we, in our cleverness, finally outsmarted our own wisdom? Have we built a global system so complex and so interconnected that its collapse is now the single greatest existential threat we face? The weapons we have created, the rivalries we have nurtured, and the planetary systems we have destabilized have all converged to put our entire species on trial. We are both the defendant and the judge, and the verdict on our future is yet to be delivered. The answer to this question will be found in our collective will. It will be determined by our ability to see past the divisions of flags and ideologies, and to recognize our shared vulnerability on this small, fragile planet. The challenges of the 21st century, from climate change to pandemics to the threat of nuclear war, are global in nature and cannot be solved by any one nation alone. They demand a level of cooperation and shared identity that we have thus far failed to achieve. Our greatest enemy is not the other side of a border. It is our own tribal instinct, our ancient impulse to see the world in terms of us versus them. This is the impulse that has driven every war in history, and it is the one that now threatens to drive our last. So we leave you with this final thought. The future is unwritten. The abyss is not yet our home. The capacity for survival, for empathy, for reason, and for peace is coded into our DNA just as deeply as our capacity for conflict. The story of humanity has been a long and often brutal struggle between our better angels and our darkest demons. Now, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance, we must choose which one will define our final chapter. The choice is ours, and it must be made now, before it is too late.